When we begin to speak of wounds, we often imagine scars that can be touched, bruises that can be seen. But the empath's wound is of another order. It is invisible, carved not into the flesh, but into the psyche. These fractures in the unseen are where the spirit has been drained, manipulated, and pierced by forces that seldom show themselves openly. This is why the empath's suffering after narcissistic abuse feels at once so devastating and so difficult to name. It takes place in the silent realm beneath the conscious mind, the very territory Carl Jung devoted his life to mapping, the unconscious, where shadows make their home. Here we find the empath, not as a romantic ideal of endless compassion, but as a vessel without a lid, absorbing everything that touches it. Beauty, vitality, yes, but also poison. To live like this is to be perpetually permeable, open not just to the joys of others, but to their rage, despair, and hunger. When such a vessel encounters the narcissist, the archetype of the devouring void, the endless appetite for attention and control, the result is not mere happenstance. It is an archetypal dance. One consumes, the other feeds. One projects a light that is false, the other follows until emptied. And yet, paradoxically, this very dance, so often devastating, is also an initiation. The narcissist becomes a dark priest of sorts, an unwilling initiator forcing the empath to confront their deepest crucible. This is the central question that arises. What is the final stage for the empath after such devastation? Most people imagine healing as restoration, a return to some pristine innocence before the wound. But Jung teaches us that individuation does not mean going back. The door to the past is sealed. To attempt return is to deny the initiation itself. The empath's task is not restoration, but transmutation, moving forward into a form of selfhood that is no longer defined by the roles of victim or savior. This is the truth that unsettles many. The final stage is not about becoming who you once were, but about becoming someone entirely new. At this early point in our story, I invite you, the listener, to pause and consider your own journey. Have you ever mistaken restoration for healing? Have you clung to the fantasy that if only you could erase the pain, life would return to what it was before? Jung would remind us, individuation never takes us backward. It always carries us deeper into paradox, into the furnace where light and shadow must finally meet. And here, the story brings us to a dream. The empath walks through a forest at night with a lantern glowing faintly. Shadows press in. A radiant figure appears, magnetic, promising warmth. Entranced, the empath follows, only to find the figure dissolving into the dark, leaving the lantern extinguished. At first, it is pure betrayal. Yet in the silence, the empath notices something astonishing. Their own hands begin to glow. The light they sought outside was always within. What a potent image this is, not just for the empath's personal healing, but for the universal human truth Jung called the self. The archetypal wholeness buried deep within us all. This story sets the motif for the entire narrative, from mirror to source, from seeking light outside to realizing it within. The empath's journey through abuse is not meaningless cruelty, but a forced confrontation with this truth. The narcissist, in their shadowed role, serves as the crucible, pressing the empath toward the only discovery that can liberate them, that the light does not need to be borrowed. It can emanate from the self. As we move further into this unfolding, keep in mind that this is not triumphalism. The empath does not leap from devastation to glory in a single bound. The path winds, contracts, expands, and often descends before it ascends. Yet this initial recognition that healing is not return but transfiguration, not erasure but integration, is the compass point. It is what allows all the rest to follow. Before we turn toward the mirror of shadow and the alchemical furnace, let me invite you, if you are listening right now, to share in the comments where and when you are watching this. Your presence matters in this shared journey. And if you wish to stay close to these explorations of Jung and the archetypal patterns of healing, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will not miss the unfolding of this mythic narrative. Together we are tracing not just ideas, but a lived path of transformation. The empath's wound, invisible though it may be, is not the end of their story. It is the opening act of initiation. And as the lantern fades in the forest, only to be replaced by the glow of their own hands, we begin to glimpse what Jung called the deepest law of the psyche, that wholeness comes only when shadow and light are reconciled. With this first vision, the story now leads us naturally into the crucible of shadow, where the narcissist becomes mirror and where the work of transmutation begins. The empath's encounter with the narcissist is not only a human tragedy, it is also a mirror. In Jung's language, projection is the psyche's way of placing disowned parts of ourselves into the world around us. When the empath looks at the narcissist, they see arrogance, hunger, and an insatiable need to be adored. But what Jung suggests is far more unsettling, that these qualities, in distorted form, belong also to the empath. The desire to be seen without giving endlessly, to be cherished without earning it, to be at the center of another's world. These are not foreign impulses. They are part of the empath's own shadow. And when disowned, they find a stage upon which to perform. The narcissist. This is why the relationship feels so magnetic. It is not simply attraction to another person's charm. It is an unconscious recognition. The empath is drawn because the narcissist holds a piece of their own psyche, an unlived hunger, disguised as someone else. The narcissist becomes the dark mirror, and the empath follows as though compelled. To dissolve this projection is terrifying, because it means owning qualities one has long judged as selfish or shameful. Yet without this ownership, the empath remains bound to the narcissist, forever chasing what they believe only the other can provide. Here is where the alchemical image becomes crucial. Consider the empath as the alchemist and the narcissist as the base material, heavy, toxic, unrefined lead. The relationship is the furnace. The flames of betrayal, manipulation, and despair burn so hot that the empath can no longer escape the truth of what is being cooked. If they resist, they remain stuck in endless suffering. If they yield, they discover something extraordinary: the capacity to transmute lead into gold. The narcissist does not vanish. The memories do not dissolve. But what emerges is a new metal, an inner strength luminous precisely because it has passed through darkness. This transformation is not a triumph of the ego. It is not about the empath declaring, "I am stronger, I am better, I am above this now." Jung warned against such illusions. The real work is humbling. To see that survival and awakening did not come from willpower alone, but from something deeper, something Jung called the self. This archetype of wholeness moves beneath conscious control, guiding the psyche through patterns of death and rebirth until a fuller integration becomes possible. The empath bows before this truth, realizing that even the most brutal suffering was not wasted. It was part of a larger design. Dreams often confirm this shift. One dreamer described being pursued through endless corridors by a shadowy figure. At last, they entered a room with no doors or windows. The pursuer vanished. In the center stood a mirror. As they gazed, their reflection dissolved into light. Such a dream reveals the essence of this alchemical process. What we flee outside is what we must confront inside. The narcissist's hunger is not just theirs, it is also the empath's. To see this is not to excuse cruelty, but to integrate shadow. Without this step, individuation cannot proceed. Notice the paradox here. To reject the narcissist entirely is to reject one's own shadow. To cling to them is to remain ensnared in projection. But to recognize them as the crucible, the unwilling teacher, is to achieve freedom. The empath learns that what they most feared, selfish desire, hunger for recognition, is not poison when owned with consciousness. It becomes energy, vitality, fuel for authentic selfhood. Only then does the narcissist lose power, because they no longer carry a stolen fragment of the empath's soul. Imagine again the furnace. At first, the empath is thrown into despair, crushed by manipulation. But in that crucible, something begins to change. Slowly, painfully, the empath awakens to their own capacity for transmutation. They emerge no longer as lead victims, but as beings of gold, radiant not because they were untouched by darkness, but because they have passed through it and claimed its wisdom. This is the essence of individuation, not purity, but integration. The empath at this stage recognizes a subtle shift. No longer do they chase the narcissist's approval as proof of worth. No longer do they imagine salvation through fixing the unfixable. Instead, they feel a strange stillness, a dissolution of the compulsion to heal others as a way of proving their own value. The narcissist has been unmasked as both tormentor and teacher. And with that, the empath stands at the threshold of a new kind of freedom. Yet this freedom is fragile. The path ahead still winds through deserts of silence and eruptions of sacred anger. But the compass is set. The mirror has revealed its truth. The furnace has done its work. And the empath is no longer only a vessel for others, but a vessel of transformation. From this point on, every step carries them further away from projection and deeper into integration. This realization leads naturally into the barren silence of separation, where the empath confronts solitude, emptiness, and the long-suppressed fire of anger. For only through this desert can the seeds of individuation take root and grow. When the empath finally parts from the narcissist, the external drama falls silent, but the inner terrain becomes even more daunting. At first, this silence is not peace, but an echoing void. Jung compared such moments to standing in the desert, where every false oasis dissolves, and the wanderer is forced to confront thirst until they discover the spring within. For the empath, this desert is the barren hall of solitude, the absence of voices, the absence of someone else's storm to absorb. The haunting question arises: who am I without the chaos? It is here that the empath realizes how often what they called compassion was a defense against emptiness, and what they called love was sometimes a refusal to meet their own loneliness. To sit in silence without collapsing requires immense courage. The narcissist's departure may feel like death, but it is a necessary stripping. Illusions crumble, fantasies evaporate, and in the vast stillness the psyche prepares for a new birth. Anger often arrives next, and though frightening, this anger is sacred. For years, the empath has been told, implicitly or explicitly, that anger is forbidden, that goodness means patience without limit and forgiveness without end. But repressed anger festers in the unconscious, mutating into resentment and self-betrayal. When it finally erupts, it feels volcanic. Yet Jung reminds us that such eruptions can be life-giving. Anger becomes fire, the fire that burns away illusion and establishes boundary. Without it, the empath risks remaining a ghost, endlessly giving, drained of vitality. With it, they finally claim their right to exist, not just for others, but for themselves. This fire, however, brings an unwelcome truth. The empath was not only victim. They too found a kind of identity in self-sacrifice. To give without end allowed them to feel morally superior, to wield subtle control through martyrdom. This complicity is painful to face, but individuation requires it. To admit I was not only wounded, I was also complicit in the dance, rescues the empath from the prison of innocence. It releases them from repeating the cycle. Shadow, once acknowledged, loses its grip. From here, we see the paradox sharpen. The empath is both light and dark, both healer and manipulator, both wounded and wounding. To integrate this paradox is to step closer to wholeness. Jung often emphasized that the psyche seeks balance, not purity. If the empath insists on identifying only with goodness, the shadow will keep dragging them back through endless repetitions of abuse. But if they embrace the paradox, they begin to walk a new path. Dreams during this stage often reveal the threshold imagery: rooms without doors, mirrors dissolving into light, deserts stretching without end. Each image is a symbolic confrontation with the self. The narcissist may still appear in these dreams, but not as captor, rather as a figure that leads back to the empath's own shadow. These images are guides. They signal that individuation is underway, though it feels unbearable. The empath now learns to wield anger as sacred fire, not destructive rage. It becomes fuel for saying no, for setting boundaries, for declaring, "I will not give myself away to be loved." This shift is radical. For years, identity was tethered to being the one who absorbs, heals, and endures. To step into anger is to claim selfhood. It is the moment of standing upright, refusing to remain spectral. And yet, this moment is not the end. It is another threshold. Because once boundaries are reclaimed, the empath must decide what comes next. If they remain in resentment, they stay tied to the narcissist. If they transmute resentment into discernment, they move forward. The desert, then, is both the place of danger and the place of possibility. It tests whether the empath will collapse into bitterness or be reborn through fire. In this stage, the empath may feel stripped bare, without illusions, without external anchors. But this nakedness is the soil in which individuation germinates. Through anger, shadow ownership, and the acceptance of paradox, they begin to reclaim the energy once projected outward. The narcissist loses their hold not because they change, but because the empath no longer gives them a piece of their soul. The desert's silence, the eruption of sacred anger, and the confrontation with complicity prepare the empath for the next transformation, the emergence of sovereignty. For beyond anger lies the discovery of the no that protects life. And beyond that, the healing power that flows not from depletion, but from the fullness of being. Out of the desert silence and the blaze of sacred anger, the empath begins to feel the first stirrings of sovereignty. It does not appear suddenly, like a crown descending upon their head, but quietly, as the ability to say a clean, unapologetic no. For so long, the empath has been conditioned to equate love with sacrifice, to equate worth with self-erasure. Each boundary they set once felt like betrayal, each refusal like cruelty. But in this stage, The no becomes holy. It is no longer an act of rejection, but of protection. It guards the flame of selfhood that has only just been rekindled. This reclamation of power is crucial because it shifts the empath's posture from perpetual giving to balanced exchange. Jung insisted that individuation requires a confrontation with opposites. For the empath, the opposite of boundless receptivity is rightful self-assertion. The narcissist distorted self-assertion into domination, exploitation, and hunger without empathy. But self-assertion itself is not evil. When reclaimed and tempered by compassion, it becomes the ground of sovereignty. The empath learns to stand at the center of their life, not at its margins. This is the paradox of healing. The very qualities that once seemed corrupt now become vital tools for wholeness. From this stance, a new archetype emerges: the wounded healer. The empath who once sought to heal in order to be loved now heals as a natural overflow of wholeness. This distinction is radical. Healing is no longer a bargaining chip, no longer a desperate attempt to secure safety. It is fruit, not compulsion. When the empath gives now, it is not from depletion but from abundance. They can offer presence without being consumed, forgiveness without erasure, love without annihilation. This transformation can feel disorienting. For the empath, identity was long fused with the savior role. To stop rescuing as a means of self-definition can leave a void. Yet within that void grows something far sturdier: the recognition that their worth is not conditional on how much they can endure. Jung might describe this as moving from persona, the mask of the healer, to self, the archetype of totality. The healer's mask falls, but the true healing capacity deepens. Dreams at this stage often portray images of shedding skin or stepping out of old garments. One dreamer spoke of being wrapped in heavy robes that cracked and fell away, revealing lighter clothing beneath. Another described wings trembling into being after years of entrapment in a cocoon. Such images signal that the old identity of the martyr is dissolving and a sovereign form is taking shape. This is not a denial of the wound, but a transfiguration of it. The empath remains a healer, but no longer at their own expense. The practical effect of this stage is striking. The empath learns to give without losing themselves. They recognize the difference between compassion and compulsion. They notice when the impulse to heal springs from fear of abandonment rather than genuine overflow. Slowly, they build a new rhythm of relating, one that allows connection without collapse, generosity without depletion. The narcissist no longer defines them, not because narcissists vanish from the world, but because the empath is no longer bound by the compulsion to redeem what cannot be redeemed. This sovereignty, however, is not arrogance. It is not a declaration of superiority or immunity. Jung warned that the ego loves to disguise itself in triumphal costumes. The true mark of sovereignty is humility before the self. The empath recognizes that the power to heal, to give, to set boundaries, these are not achievements of ego, but movements of a deeper center. The self, as archetype, orchestrates these transformations through patterns far larger than conscious control. To bow before that self is to recognize that even suffering served a mysterious purpose. At this point, we begin to glimpse the empath as the wounded healer fully realized. Their presence becomes luminous, not because they seek to shine, but because they embody integration. Others may sense it as steadiness, authenticity, compassion free of agenda. The empath is no longer a mirror endlessly reflecting others, but a source radiating light from within. This shift is palpable, and it marks a turning point in their individuation. Yet the journey is not complete. Having reclaimed sovereignty and embraced the wounded healer, the empath is now ready to step into deeper symbolic territory. The cocoon that once imprisoned them reveals itself as a chrysalis, preparing them for rebirth. Ahead lies the mythic imagery of descent and transformation, where the empath encounters the archetype of the inner elder and discovers guidance that arises not from others, but from the depths of their own soul. The empath who has reclaimed sovereignty now stands in a liminal space, balanced between what has been shed and what has not yet arrived. Here, the imagery of chrysalis and metamorphosis takes center stage. Just as the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness before becoming a butterfly, the empath must pass through a state of suspension. The narcissist, once tormentor, is re-seen as the cocoon, an enclosing darkness that, paradoxically, created the conditions for transformation. Within this cocoon, identity dissolved, illusions burned away, and something winged began to take shape. The chrysalis is not comfortable. It is claustrophobic, suffocating, and at times unbearable. Many empaths describe this phase as a kind of death, not just mourning the relationship, but mourning the self they thought they were. The identity of savior, giver, or martyr must fall apart, for it was always a fragile shell. Jung often described such moments in mythic language: the descent into the underworld, the stripping away of garments before the gates, the phoenix consumed by fire. These are not just stories. They are archetypal maps of what the psyche undergoes in order to be reborn. And as in myth, guides appear. In dreams, the empath may encounter the archetype of the inner elder, a wise figure who speaks not with manipulation, but with riddles and truths. At first, this voice may feel alien, even suspect. After all, the empath has long been conditioned to trust others above themselves, to defer to external authorities, to see wisdom as something residing out there. But gradually, the recognition dawns. This elder is not external. It is the soul itself, speaking from the depths. The validation once sought from the narcissist was always a distorted reflection of this inner wisdom. The integration of the inner elder is a decisive step in individuation. It signifies the shift from dependence on external light to reliance on the light within. Guidance no longer comes through projection or manipulation, but through inner dialogue. The empath begins to notice subtle shifts in their perception, a newfound discernment, a steadier center, a capacity to listen inwardly without collapsing into doubt. Compassion expands, but now it includes themselves. The empath laughs without desperation, forgives without erasure, gives without destruction. This is sovereignty anchored in the self. The paradox of this stage is that it can feel both liberating and isolating. To see with new eyes is to recognize patterns of unconscious manipulation, not just in one's abuser, but in family, friends, even society itself. At first, this awareness can feel like standing on a lonely mountain, estranged from the familiar world. But in time, the empath understands. This vision is not to separate them, but to empower them. Having walked through the labyrinth, they now carry a lantern of consciousness, not to lead others compulsively, but to illuminate the path simply by being. At this juncture, the empath often discovers an unexpected surge of creative energy. Pain that once silenced the voice now demands expression. Some begin to write, paint, or sing. Others turn toward guiding, counseling, or simply living with a radiance that cannot be hidden. The point is not what they do, but what they embody. Authenticity free of compulsion. Creativity flows because energy once spent in overgiving now courses inward, fueling expression rather than depletion. Dreams in this stage are often rich with images of union and fertility. gardens blooming within ruined cities, pearls glowing in dark waters, bridges of light extending across abysses. Such symbols testify that integration has been achieved. The ruined city of abuse now contains a hidden garden. The dark waters of suffering conceal treasures. The abyss itself becomes traversable, illuminated by the empath's own essence. These dreams confirm that what was once devastation has become fertile ground. The empath now moves as both sovereign and servant of the self. They recognize that wholeness is not perfection, but paradox. Stronger yet softer. Discerning yet compassionate, more whole yet more aware of complexity. They look back on their story and see both cruelty and gift, both wound and wisdom. And in this paradox, they find peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the ability to stand at the center of life's opposites without being torn apart. This stage prepares the empath for the culmination of their journey, the transfiguration in which wholeness, forgiveness, and collective resonance intertwine. Having integrated shadow, reclaimed sovereignty, and listened to the inner elder, they are now ready to step beyond survival into a radiance that touches not only themselves, but the collective field of human consciousness. The empath's path now moves toward its culmination. Not mere survival, not even recovery, but transfiguration. To speak of this stage is to step into mythic language, because ordinary terms cannot contain it. Jung himself often emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not about erasing suffering, but about transforming it into meaning. And in the final stage of the empath, every fragment of suffering, every shadowy figure, every barren silence is revealed as part of a larger design. Here forgiveness arises, but not as many imagine. It is not the shallow forgiveness of excusing cruelty or pretending wounds did not matter. It is not about reconciling with the narcissist in life. True forgiveness emerges as a consequence of wholeness. The empath sees that to cling to hatred is to remain tethered to the abuser. Forgiveness in this sense is release. The chains of resentment fall away, and the empath steps free. The narcissist returns to the shadow where they belong, and the empath reclaims the fullness of their own soul. This forgiveness is not a gift to the narcissist, but a liberation of the self. With forgiveness comes vision. The empath no longer sees their story as a private tragedy, but as part of a collective myth. They recognize themselves in Orpheus descending into the underworld, in Inanna stripped at the gates, in Christ bearing the cross, in the phoenix rising from its own ashes. These stories are not distant fables. They are the language of the unconscious, whispering that the empath's journey is archetypal, universal. To know this is to find dignity in suffering. It was not meaningless. It was initiation. The fruit of this initiation is paradoxical strength. The empath feels softer yet stronger, more compassionate yet more discerning. They can sit with their wounds without being ruled by them. They can face their shadow without collapsing into it. They can even encounter new narcissists, sense the old pull, and simply whisper inwardly, "I see the pattern. I need not enter again." This is freedom, not from pain itself, but from the compulsion to repeat pain. Dreams in this stage often carry images of mandalas, circles, spirals, and gardens. These symbols point to integration, to the psyche's return to its center. One dreamer described walking through a ruined city where flowers bloomed in cracks of stone. Another, swimming through dark waters to find glowing pearls on the seabed. These are not hallucinations, but the psyche's way of testifying. The ruin now shelters new life. The descent has yielded treasure. The brokenness itself has become fertile, And from this wholeness flows a final gift: presence. The empath no longer overgives in desperation, nor withholds in fear. They give naturally, radiantly, because their energy is sourced from the self. This presence is not a mask, not a performance, but authenticity embodied. Others sense it, a steadiness, a compassion free of agenda. And in their presence, others begin their own awakening. The empath becomes not just healed, but healer. Not just free, but liberator. Not just whole, but a living symbol of what it means to be fully human. To reach this stage is to realize that transfiguration does not erase wounds. The scars remain, but they become symbols, maps of where the soul has traveled. The empath sees that what was broken was only the shell, not the essence. What was taken was illusion, not the soul. The narcissist, paradoxically, gave them back to themselves. The fire revealed gold. The cocoon gave wings. The shadow led them to the self, so the empath arrives at last in the silence that once terrified them. But now it is no longer emptiness. It is the silence of inner strength. They can dwell alone without collapse, connect without dissolving, love without losing themselves. They embody the paradox Jung cherished. To be human is to hold light and shadow, love and anger, giving and receiving in one whole. This is not perfection, it is integration. And so we come to the whisper that rises at the end of the journey. You no longer need to beg for what you already are. That whisper is the self, long buried under projection, now speaking with clarity. It declares that individuation has been achieved. The empath is no longer defined by abuse, nor trapped in the cycle of savior and victim. They are whole, they are free, they are self. This is the final stage, transfiguration. And in that transformation, the empath does not only heal, they become a bearer of light forged in darkness, a symbol for others that even the cruelest wounds can lead to wholeness. At the close of this journey, it is vital to gather the threads into a single woven image. What began as invisible wounds inflicted in silence has become a myth of transformation. The empath, once an open vessel at the mercy of every storm, now stands as a sovereign being, radiant from within. This is not a fairy tale of escape, nor a triumphal anthem of ego. It is a deeper story, the story of individuation. Forgiveness has become liberation, not absolution. Anger has become fire, not destruction. Silence has become strength, not emptiness. Every element that once tormented now serves as a teacher. Jung called this the reconciliation of opposites, the capacity to stand at the center of paradox without being torn apart. And this, finally, is what makes the empath whole. The narcissist, for all their cruelty, was never just an enemy. They were also a crucible, a cocoon, a shadowed initiator. This recognition does not excuse harm, but it lifts suffering into meaning. It reveals that even darkness serves the mystery of wholeness. To see this is to release resentment and to honor the self's larger design. In this stage, the empath discovers a new rhythm of life. They can give without depletion, witness pain without drowning, and love without losing their center. They laugh more freely, create more authentically, and stand more firmly in their own body. Their compassion deepens not because they erase themselves, but because they finally include themselves. This is the paradox of individuation. The more one embraces one's own wholeness, the more one can meet others as equals. Perhaps the most profound shift is in identity. The empath is no longer defined by the wound. They no longer introduce themselves to the world as a survivor, a martyr, or a rescuer. They are instead a whole human being, one who carries scars as symbols, not shackles. Their very presence becomes testimony that the psyche seeks not safety, but wholeness, not avoidance of shadow, but its integration. As you reflect on this journey, you may notice echoes in your own life. Perhaps you have endured the manipulations of someone who fed on your openness. Perhaps you have mistaken sacrifice for love, silence for harmony, or forgiveness for erasure. If so, Jung's map offers both challenge and hope. The challenge is to face your own shadow, to admit complicity, to reclaim power without distortion. The hope is that within this crucible lies gold, within the cocoon lies wings, within the ashes lies the phoenix. The path is arduous, but it is also archetypal. No suffering of such depth is meaningless, and so we end with 3 simple declarations. The culmination of all that has been said. You are whole. You are free. You are self. Let these words echo not as affirmations from outside, but as whispers from your own depths. They are reminders that the journey is already unfolding within you. The final stage is not far away. It begins wherever you choose to listen to that whisper and honor its truth.